The winter storm had blown in before midday, sweeping down from the peaks of northern Arizona like a white freight train. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. By the time Grant Steele realized how fast it was closing in snow, already erased the trail behind him. He'd been swinging his axe since dawn, dropping 2 tall pines and cutting them to lengths he could drag out once spring thawed the ground. He'd stayed too long thinking he could finish one more cut. But the wind shifted, and the sky turned the color of bleached bone. Soon the forest was nothing but swirling ghosts of snow, the cold slicing each breath like a knife. Grant trudged forward through drifts up to his knees, boots crunching and sliding. His gloves were soaked, the wool stiff as boards, and he kept shifting the axe across his back, where the handle bit into his shoulder. He was no stranger to hard winters or long, lonely seasons, but this storm had teeth, and he knew it could kill a man. Hours earlier, his mule had bolted, spooked by the sudden white fury, and chasing it was out of the question. Now he had only the pack on his back, dry bread, a strip of salted pork, a bit of flint. When his boot snagged on an icy root and he crashed to one knee, pain shot up his leg. He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. Grant had been alone for years. Ever since his brother Asher Steele died in a logging accident that still haunted his nights, he'd lived with the truth that no one was coming if he fell. He'd told himself he didn't need anyone, that work and silence were enough. But storms like this could make even the toughest man doubt his own stubborn heart. Through the white blur, he spotted a jagged, dark rock cutting the endless snow. Squinting against the sting of wind, he saw it was a cliff face, with a shadow carved into its side, a cave. Relief hit him like a hammer, loosening the knot in his chest. Half stumbling, half dragging himself, Grant pushed across the drifts until he reached the opening. The wind screamed at his back. But inside the cave, the world went suddenly still. He pulled back his hood, shaking ice from his beard. At first he saw only stone and blackness. Then a faint flicker of firelight trembled deeper in. He froze. Someone was already there. A small fire burned low, and beside it sat a young Apache woman. Her dark hair spilled loose over her shoulders, a wool blanket wrapped close. Underneath, he caught the edge of a deerskin dress beadwork dulled with age, the shoulder seam torn so that a curve of skin glimmered in the shifting glow. She sat perfectly still, but her eyes, deep brown, unblinking, locked on him the moment he stepped inside. In her hand, she gripped a stone, as if it were a blade. Grant slowly raised both hands, the axe still strapped to his back. His heart hammered. He'd expected an empty cave, maybe a wild animal, not this. "I don't mean you harm," he said, voice rough from the cold. "Storm's bad. Just need a corner till it blows out." She didn't answer. Her stare stayed hard. The blanket inched higher across her chest, but the stone in her hand never lowered. The cold gnawed at him. His boots were soaked, his gloves stiff as bark. Night was dropping fast, and he didn't have the strength to walk back into the blizzard. So he held his ground palms open, breathing hard. From the beadwork on her dress and the proud set of her face, he knew she was Apache. He'd seen camps burn in the past, and men treat women like spoils, a memory that filled him with old shame. But this was no camp. This was one woman alone, surviving. The fire popped sharply, the only sound between them. Grant fought the urge to explain himself further. He had lived years avoiding people carrying grief like a pack too heavy to set down, yet the weight of her gaze pressed against him in a way he hadn't felt for a long time. He almost turned back into the storm, but a memory of Asher stopped him, the day a log rolled and crushed his brother while Grant stood too slow to help. Leaving now would feel the same, walking away and letting fate decide. So he lowered his hands and took one step back toward the wall instead of forward. Slowly he slid his pack to the stone floor and eased himself down to sit, keeping a careful distance. The firelight threw their shadows long across the rough cave walls. Neither spoke. Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside, there was only the crackle of fire and the sound of her steady breath. Who was she? How long had she been hidden in these mountains? Why all alone? He kept those questions locked behind his teeth. At last, the woman shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. Her eyes softened just enough to let him breathe easier, but the stone never left her hand. She never lowered the rock yet. She never lifted it higher. In that quiet standoff, Grant Steele suddenly understood this shelter wasn't his at all. It belonged to Ahyoka Moon. He was the intruder. And if he hoped to outlast the storm brute force would get him nowhere. Only respect would. Grant eased back against the cold wall, letting the fire warm him from a careful distance. Survival was the only thing that mattered tonight. Talk or trust would have to wait. Outside, the blizzard howled like a living beast packing snow against the cave mouth until the world beyond was nothing but a muffled roar. Inside, the fire burned low, its orange glow making the rock walls seem to breathe. Grant sat with his back to the stone boots stretched before him, watching the woman without openly staring. She hadn't moved since he entered. The blanket hugged her shoulders, knees drawn close, that rock still poised in her hand, though her grip had softened. In the wavering light, he saw the hollows of her cheeks, the weary lines at her mouth, the worn deerskin dress torn from long use. Younger than he'd first guessed, mid-20s maybe, but her eyes carried the weight of years. He knew enough of frontier life to read the signs. Apache families had been broken by soldiers and raiders scattered to the winds. Many women were captured or sold. A few escaped only to vanish into hidden places. Looking at her now, he understood why she had chosen this cave, dry, secluded, close to a spring. Grant's stomach tightened. He reached slowly for his pack, careful not to startle her. She stiffened, eyes narrowing. He pulled out a strip of hard bread, broke it in two, and nudged the larger half toward her with his boot before taking a bite of the other himself. The crunch echoed in the silence. She studied him, eyes flicking from his face to the bread, measuring the risk. At last, she reached out, swift and sure, and drew it into her blanket. She ate in small, cautious bites, never looking away. Grant chewed slower, the dry bread catching in his throat. He uncapped his canteen, drank, then slid it across the stone. After a pause, she lifted it, took a brief sip, and handed it back, her hand trembling slightly. Bread and water. Nothing more, but it carried the weight of a fragile truce. Grant exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. Hours dragged on. He tried to rest, but the cold floor and her steady watch kept him half awake. When he opened his eyes again, the fire was fading. She was moving now, laying a small bundle of sticks on the coals. He hadn't seen the stash before. She must have gathered them in advance. She knelt near the flames, her blanket slipping to bare more of one shoulder, the torn deerskin shifting with her motion. Firelight traced pale skin against dark leather. Grant forced his gaze away, shame burning hotter than the fire. To steady himself, he let his mind wander back to how he'd ended up in this valley. After Asher Steele died beneath a rolling log, Grant had drifted from camp to camp, burying grief in hard labor and endless silence. Cutting timber gave him purpose, the sure swing of an axe, the crack of wood, but it never filled the long nights. A soft voice broke the quiet. Ahyoka. She said the name carrying both caution and offering. Grant lifted his head. Ahyoka, he echoed carefully, then pointed to himself. Grant. Her dark gaze weighed him, then dipped in a small nod. A pact made without ceremony. They spoke no more for hours. When the fire sank too low, Grant rose. She tensed, stone ready, but he only walked to the cave mouth. Snow had piled high, but not sealed it. He pushed through boots, crunching, and gathered frozen branches beneath the ledges. His fingers were numb, but he carried back an armload, split them with the axe head, and stacked them near the fire. She watched in silence, her blanket's snug face unreadable. Perhaps she wondered what kind of white man brought firewood instead of harm. When the flames leapt higher, the cave warmed. Exhaustion dragged at him. Grant settled back, catching her eyes for an instant. For the first time, she didn't look away. It wasn't trust, not yet, but neither was it rejection. Just the unspoken truth, the storm had locked them together, and whatever grief or fear they carried would have to wait until morning. Survival came first. As the fire sank to faint embers, Grant Steele finally drifted into uneasy sleep-acts, within easy reach, while the storm outside raged like a living enemy. Ahyoka Moon stayed awake longer, eyes fixed on him, weighing whether this stranger in her refuge meant harm or something she couldn't yet name. For the first time in many lonely months, she wasn't sure what she wanted to believe. The fire burned low again when Grant stirred his neck stiff from the stone wall. Pale morning light seeped through the snow-choked entrance, and for a heartbeat he forgot where he was, half expecting the clang of saws and men shouting in a timber camp. But only the faint crack of embers and the soft shift of fabric greeted him. Ahyoka crouched by the fire, the blanket draped around her shoulders as she fed slender twigs to the flames. Her dark hair spilled forward, nearly brushing the coals. When she heard him move, she turned slightly calm and watchful. Grant pushed himself upright, joints aching, and drew in the sharp, cold air. The bread he'd shared with her the night before lay finished, just crumbs left. She avoided glancing at his pack, making clear she hadn't touched a thing he hadn't offered. That quiet honesty stirred something like respect in him. He reached into the pack, pulled out a strip of salted pork, and set it between them. Tearing off a piece, he chewed and nodded for her to take the rest. After a pause, she reached out quick and sure and tucked it beneath her blanket. "How long you been here?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She studied him, then tipped her head toward the cave mouth. Since summer, she said, her English halting but clear. "Alone," he pressed. A single nod. The weight of that answer settled heavy in his chest. A woman alone for months in these mountains, braving storms and scraping for food, it defied belief. He wondered how she'd kept alive. Without a word, she drew out a small pouch and set it down. Inside were dried berries, acorn meal, and scraps of venison, barely enough to get by. Grant thought of the mule he'd lost to the blizzard, carrying a half-sack of grain and precious meat. The thought burned. While she'd survived on crumbs, his supplies lay wasted in the snow. Silence stretched until Ahyoka spoke again, her voice softer. "Husband dead. Raiders." The words cut deeper than he expected. He stared at the fire, jaw tight. It was no surprise too many widows along the frontier bore that same scar, but hearing it from her lips filled the cave with heavier air. Shame and anger twisted in him, shame for men of his own race who had taken part in such raids, anger that she had been driven to hide in cold stone. Words felt too thin. Instead, Grant reached for his axe and began splitting a branch with steady blows. Steel on wood echoed through the cave action, not talk. She watched a long while, then quietly pulled out a bone needle and sinew thread. Without a word, she took his coat torn at the sleeve and began stitching. The morning passed that way, him splitting wood, her mending cloth, while the storm outside softened to a quiet drift. They didn't speak yet. Something between them shifted. By noon, Grant gathered more firewood and motioned toward the entrance, silently asking if she wished to step outside. She shook her head, drawing the blanket tighter. He understood after so many months hiding the world beyond promised only danger. He went alone into the biting cold, dragging back frozen branches until his arms burned. When he returned, she had moved closer to the fire. The blanket had slipped slightly, and the torn deerskin beneath bared more of her shoulder. The glimpse of soft skin caught the light, and he looked away quickly. That night, as darkness settled, he chose a place farther from the flames so she could keep the warmer spot. She glanced at him as he stretched out coat pulled over him, axe within reach. He read the unspoken question in her eyes. Why not closer? Why not take what he might? But she didn't ask, and he didn't explain. He had no right. Sleep came slowly. He listened to the faint rustle of her blanket, the quiet rhythm of her breath. He hadn't shared space with a woman since before Asher Steele died, and the memory weighed on him. One wrong move, one careless word, and he could break the fragile trust forming here. He turned to the stone wall, jaw tight. He would not be the kind of man she feared. Near dawn, when the fire lay in ashes and the cold crept deep, Grant woke to find the blanket had shifted. She had left a corner of it within his reach, a silent offer of warmth. He hesitated, then drew it gently over his shoulders. She did not stir, did not open her eyes, her breathing calm and steady. It was the smallest of gestures, but in that frozen cove it spoke louder than words. Wrapped in that shared warmth, Grant felt something stir inside him, something beyond mere survival. He felt the first fragile shape of trust settle deep inside. When Grant Steele woke, the memory of that shared blanket lingered. The fire had burned low, and the cave air bit cold, yet the wool draped over his shoulders still carried the warmth of Ahyoka Moon's silent gift. She hadn't spoken or even stirred when he'd drawn the blanket across himself, but that quiet act said more than any words. Rising slowly so as not to wake her, though he sensed from her steady breathing she was only feigning sleep, Grant moved toward the cave's entrance and kicked aside the drifted snow. The storm had eased overnight, but the world outside lay locked in a white grip. Snow reached nearly to his thighs, the morning air sharp enough to cut through his heavy coat. He gathered firewood from under a rocky ledge where the wind hadn't buried everything, then hauled the load back inside. Ahyoka was already sitting upright, the blanket snug around her eyes, following his every move. No words, no hostility, just quiet watchfulness. Grant crouched by the fire, splitting the wood into smaller pieces, his motions slow and deliberate. She reached for a small clay pot he hadn't noticed before, filled it with scraps of dried venison and a handful of berries poured in water from a skin bag and set it near the coals. Soon a thin, rich scent of broth warmed the cave. When she ladled some into a wooden bowl and placed it between them, Grant hesitated. One glance from her, just a slight dip of the chin, told him the meal was to share. He took a breath, sipped. The broth was mostly water, but it loosened the tightness in his chest. He slid the bowl back. She finished it in small sips, eyes never straying long from his. "You've been here since summer," he said quietly. "Why not move on another camp some other place?" her gaze hardened. "No camp," she said, shaking her head once. "No people left." The weight of those words pressed heavy on him. He wanted to ask more, but her tightened shoulders and set jaw told him enough. He knew that look. It was the same he wore when men asked about Asher Steele. Some grief wasn't meant for talk. So he simply nodded and answered a question she hadn't voiced. "I cut timber," he said, pointing toward the axe, leaning against the wall. "Been at it a long time. Had a brother. Worked with me. He's gone now." His throat closed around the last words. She studied him unreadable, then inclined her head and softly spoke his name. "Grant." The sound of it from her lips steadied and unsettled him all at once. Through the day they found a rhythm. Grant went out twice for more branches, chopping them shorter so they'd burn clean. Ahyoka sorted berries and stitched the worn seams of her deerskin dress. When her blanket slipped, she let it rest there a while, the torn leather revealing the smooth line of her collarbone, pale skin glowing in the firelight. He caught himself staring and forced his eyes away, shame and a quiet longing tangling in his chest. That night, as they settled by the fire again, she surprised him. Choosing each word with care, she asked, "Why you stay, storm will end. You can go. Why stay here?" Grant leaned back against the rock, staring at the flames. He thought about offering a simple excuse, but honesty came instead. "I don't know," he said at last. "Maybe because there's not much for me out there. Maybe because you're here." Her dark eyes held his, steady and unblinking. She didn't speak, but she didn't turn away either. Later, as the fire burned low, they lay down again, closer than before, though still apart. This time she didn't wait for him to sleep. She shifted the blanket until it covered them both, letting the edge fall across his chest. He stayed still, heart pounding, then breathed easier as she relaxed against the stone, her breathing even. In the darkness, questions circled how she'd survived raids, how she'd escaped soldiers or hostile townsfolk, what dangers still stalked her. He didn't ask. Trust wasn't forged in a single night. It had to be built like a careful fire. As sleep tugged at him, one thought anchored him. He no longer saw the cave as only hers, or a place where he didn't belong. It was theirs now if she chose. And though she said nothing, the way she draped that blanket told him she just might. By dawn, the storm had weakened, leaving only the slow drip of melting ice at the cave's mouth. Harsh, pale light spilled inside. Grant rose first, stiff from the stone floor, but warmer than he'd been in days thanks to the blanket they shared. He looked over at Ahyoka. She was awake, eyes quiet and steady as if waiting for his first move. He gave a single nod, said nothing, and pulled on his coat. His pack held little now, just a strip of salted pork and the final hunk of bread. But Grant Steele wasn't about to waste what remained. He knelt beside the fire, stirred the embers, and laid on fresh wood until the flames licked higher, warming the stony shelter. Across from him, Ahyoka Moon reached for her clay pot, poured in water from a deerskin bag, and dropped in the few berries left. She said nothing, but when she set the pot near the fire, she nudged it a little closer to where he sat. A simple act, yet it carried meaning. Grant chewed his piece of bread, thinking of the mule he'd lost in the storm, its pack full of grain and meat that could have kept them for weeks. He muttered a quiet curse, knowing their survival now rode on thinner rations. Game would have to be found soon. His eyes flicked to Ahyoka's thin arms beneath the blanket. She had endured months like this, foraging what the mountains offered, drying venison and gathering acorns. He knew she couldn't keep doing it alone. Searching for words she would understand, he said hunt, and mimed drawing a bow. She tilted her head, watching him, then gave a small nod. A faint softness crossed her eyes, a flicker of relief, maybe understanding he meant to bring food, not take hers. The day stretched long. Twice Grant waded into the deep snow with axe in hand, testing the drifts for any sign of rabbit or deer. Each time he returned, empty muscles aching from the struggle. Ahyoka never scolded or showed disappointment. She simply ladled the thin broth into their shared bowl, dividing it evenly. When she handed it across her fingers, brushed his brief, almost nothing. Yet the touch sent a stronger warmth through him than the fire itself. That night, the air in the cave felt different. Grant sat closer to the flames, coat drying, while Ahyoka mended another tear in her worn deerskin dress with her bone needle. The fabric barely held, and when she shifted, the neckline slipped open, revealing the graceful line of her collarbone. She adjusted it quickly, but not before catching his gaze. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Then she lowered them and kept sewing. She neither pulled away nor turned aside, only kept her shoulders square, as though testing if he would cross a line. Grant's chest tightened. He had spent years with only silence for company, long without a woman's nearness. But he also knew too well what happened when men took without asking. He refused to be that kind of man. He stood, took up his axe, and split more wood, letting the steady rhythm cool his restless thoughts. When he sat again, Ahyoka reached across the fire and laid his coat in his lap, neatly stitched. Her hand lingered a moment longer than needed. Her dark eyes rose to meet his, steady and unflinching. She whispered his name. Grant. He swallowed hard. Ahyoka, he answered. That night, the space between them narrowed. They lay beside the fire beneath a single blanket. This time, Grant didn't force himself to the outer edge. He stayed closer, his arm brushing hers through the wool. She shifted once, then settled. Her hand rested lightly on the stone between them. Minutes passed. Slowly, she slid her fingers until they touched the back of his hand. He froze, heart thundering, unsure if it was accident or intent. But her fingers stayed warm against his scarred knuckles. He turned his hand palm up, offering without demand. She wove her fingers through his, a gentle, deliberate clasp. Neither spoke. The fire snapped softly while the storm outside sank to a low hum. Grant lay awake long after absorbing what that quiet touch meant: trust, or the first breath of it. He thought how easily one wrong move could break something so fragile. The ache in his chest was real, but it was the good kind, the kind that reminded him he was still capable of more than grief. As sleep finally claimed him, her hand remained in his, sure and steady. For the first time since stumbling into this cave, Grant felt he was beginning something neither of them had expected. He woke with her hand still in his. At first he wondered if it had been a dream, but the living warmth of her palm proved otherwise. The fire had burned to embers, the cave dim with weak morning light. He shifted carefully, not wanting to break the contact, but she stirred and blinked awake. For a long breath, she looked at their joined hands, then at him. No hardness entered her eyes, no retreat. Instead, she gave the smallest nod, as if to say she knew what she had done, and she meant it. They rose without words. Grant stretched the stiffness from his shoulders and arms, the stone floor having left him sore. Ahyoka added thin branches to the fire, the quiet snap of kindling filling the cave. Their stores were nearly gone. He saw it in her pouch, a few dry berries, the last strip of venison. The knowledge weighed on him. If he didn't bring back meat soon, hunger would undo the fragile bond they'd built. "I'll try again," he said, pointing toward the mouth of the cave, and miming his axe swing. She watched him a long moment, then slowly shook her head. Snow. Too deep, she said, each word rough but clear. Grant chewed the inside of his cheek, frowning. Ahyoka Moon was right, the blizzard had buried every trail, but he couldn't sit idle. I'll try, he repeated. She hesitated, then gave a single nod. Outside, the cold bit like sharpened steel, but Grant plunged into the drifts, forcing his way through the crusted snow. He kept to the tree-line, eyes sharp for movement. After an hour, he spotted faint rabbit tracks pressed into the powder. Following them carefully, he finally dropped one with a quick throw of his axe head. It wasn't much, but it was meat. When he returned, Ahyoka waited at the cave's mouth, her blanket pulled tight. A flash of relief crossed her face before she masked it. She knelt beside him as he dressed the rabbit, her small knife moving sure and steady. Together they set the meat over the fire, and the rich scent soon filled the cave. When it was ready, she tore off a piece and offered it to him first. Grant shook his head, pushing it back toward her. She frowned and pressed it into his hand with quiet insistence. Eat, she said. He obeyed, chewing slowly, the flavor richer than anything he'd tasted in weeks. That simple act of sharing broke a wall of silence between them. Ahyoka sat close, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as the fire warmed her skin. Grant caught the subtle movement of her fingers at the edge of her deerskin dress where she had mended earlier. His chest tightened. The worn fabric gaped at the neckline, showing a soft curve each time she shifted. She met his glance and held it. She didn't pull the blanket tighter. She let it fall. Grant's pulse hammered. He forced his eyes away, keeping his hands still. His mind divided part of him, reading her nearness as invitation, another warning that trust so new could shatter in a heartbeat. A voice from memory. Asher Steele's, steady and careful, echoed inside him. You can't take what isn't freely given. Grant. The words steadied him. Quietly, he said, You don't have to fear me. Simple, but he meant every syllable. Ahyoka studied him, then slowly lifted her hand and touched the scar at his temple, tracing it with gentle fingers. Grant froze, breath caught. No one had touched that mark in years. She wasn't showing pity, only recognition. Her hand slid down to brush his beard, resting at his jaw. She leaned closer, eyes shining in the firelight. Grant didn't move at first, afraid to break the moment. Then, with a slow breath, he leaned in, too. Their lips met, soft, searching, real. She didn't pull away. When he deepened the kiss slightly, her hand pressed more firmly to his cheek. When they parted, her dark eyes stayed on his. Neither spoke. The fire cracked and hissed. Grant swallowed, chest rising and falling. I'll stay, he said at last, voice rough but sure. As long as you want me. Ahyoka's lips pressed together, then softened. She gave one quiet nod, enough. That night they lay beneath a single blanket. Grant didn't force distance. Her head rested on his shoulder, her breath warm against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their fingers found each other again and wove together. As sleep came, Grant realized he wasn't merely riding out a storm or sharing fire and food. He was sharing himself, something he hadn't done since losing Asher. When Ahyoka whispered his name softly in the dark, he knew she was offering something just as precious, the choice to stay. Morning after their kiss, Grant woke with her head still on his shoulder. For a long while he didn't move, unwilling to break the quiet. Her hair spilled across his chest, soft against the coarse wool of his shirt. her breathing even. He felt the weight of her trust more than her body. Years had passed since anyone had leaned on him without doubt. He lay listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, wondering if she would regret the night before. When she stirred, blinking awake, her gaze slid to their joined hands. Instead of pulling away, she gave a single, deliberate squeeze. Grant felt his chest ease. Whatever doubts he carried, she had none. They rose together, the rhythm of survival drawing them back to work. Grant took up his axe and stepped into the snow, seeking fresh tracks. The forest stood hushed, but alive again. He followed rabbit prints until his throw went wide, the axe striking ice with a sharp crack. He muttered a curse and returned empty-handed. Ahyoka only shook her head calm as ever and drew the last strip of venison from her pouch. She split it cleanly in two and pushed half toward him. He started to refuse, but her dark eyes hardened, daring him to insult her gift. Grant accepted in silence, the quiet bond between them stronger than words. Grant chewed the last bite slowly. They ate without hurry, yet the silence between them no longer felt like distance. Later, as the fire leapt higher, Ahyoka Moon pointed toward his axe. "Work," she said, then mimed a chopping motion. Grant Steele replied, repeating the word until she shaped it with her own lips. She touched her chest. "Ahyoka." Then she pointed at him. "Grant," he answered with a faint smile. Through the day, they built a quiet bridge of words, small halting, but enough to stitch two lives closer. When he said water, she echoed softly. When she said sun, pointing at the pale light breaking through retreating clouds, he repeated her sound. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Night brought a deeper warmth to the cave. Grant sat sharpening his axe with slow, deliberate strokes, while Ahyoka mended another seam of her worn deerskin dress. The fabric was giving way, and each movement revealed a little more of her. He tried not to stare, but she caught him once, her gaze holding his before lowering. Instead of pulling the blanket higher, she left it as it was. The air thickened, charged, but not hostile. Grant set his axe aside, breath heavy, torn between want and caution. Before he could speak, Ahyoka reached across the fire. Her fingers brushed his and slid up to his scarred hand. Turning it palm up, she traced the old wound, reading his life through touch. Grant swallowed hard. "That came from a camp accident," he murmured, pointing to the scar. Log slipped, nearly lost the hand. He wasn't sure how many words she caught, but she seemed to understand. Her eyes rose to his, steady and questioning, and he knew what she silently asked, what pain lay deepest. He gave the answer without hesitation. "My brother, Asher, died working with me." She didn't look away. Instead, she touched the scar on his temple, the one from the same tragedy. Her warm palm lingered against the ruff of his beard. "No more alone," she whispered, her English rough but clear. The word struck him like a hammer. He exhaled a breath that carried years of grief. Slowly he leaned toward her. She did not flinch. Their lips met again this time, sure and unhurried. The kiss deepened, heat spreading through his chest. She leaned closer, her blanket falling aside, and he drew her gently into his arms. When they parted, her forehead rested on his, both breathing hard in the flicker of firelight. Grant wanted to speak, but found no words strong enough. Instead, he held her tighter, letting silence carry what his heart already knew. That night, they lay under the blanket closer than ever. Her head rested on his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. For the first time since stepping into this cave, Grant no longer felt like a trespasser. He belonged here with her. And while snow still blanketed the valley, he thought of spring, not as something to face alone, but as a season to share. By the time he realized how many days had passed, the storm's grip had begun to loosen. No more wild howling, only the steady drip of melting ice along the cliffs. The forest remained deep in snow, but the light sharpened and grew stronger. Inside the cave, life had changed as well. Grant and Ahyoka moved with unspoken ease. He hauled wood, split it clean, and carried in snow to melt for water. She prepared their scant food-mended clothing and kept the fire steady. Nights found them wrapped together beneath the same blanket hands, naturally seeking each other in the dark. But hunger pressed closer. The rabbit meat was gone, the last berries eaten. Grant felt it in the heaviness of his limbs when he trekked through deep drifts searching for fresh game. One morning he returned empty-handed, jaw tight, frustration burning in his chest. He drove the axe into the frozen ground at the cave mouth. The clang echoed off stone. Ahyoka flinched, but didn't retreat. She rose, stepped to him, and laid a calming hand on his arm. "Enough," she said simply. The words, though broken, carried all the meaning he needed. Grant met her eyes, and the anger drained away. He nodded, pulled the axe free, and set it aside. Later that day, when the snow crusted firm, he tried again. He followed a high ridge farther than before, careful and slow. At last, he saw deer moving through the pines. Too far for a clean strike, but the sight brought something else hope. The thaw was coming. The woods would soon open, and food would return. When he returned, spent, Ahyoka had laid their blanket near the fire. She had slipped out of her deerskin dress to mend another tear, her bare shoulders bathed in the fire's glow. Grant stopped in his tracks, breath catching in his chest. She looked up at him steady and unflinching. She didn't rush to cover herself. Instead, Ahyoka Moon let Grant Steele see her as she was strong, vulnerable, unashamed. After a quiet pause, she drew the dress back over her shoulder and kept sewing. That night when they lay together, the air between them carried a restless charge. Ahyoka shifted closer until her hand brushed his chest. "You stay?" she asked softly, her voice careful but sure. Grant tightened his fingers around hers. "I'll stay," he said rough, but without a trace of doubt. "Storm ends, snow melts, it doesn't matter. I stay with you." Her dark eyes searched his face for a long moment. Then she leaned in and kissed him. This time there was no hesitation, only choice and certainty. Grant wrapped his arms around her, his palm resting against her back. She pressed into him, warm and unyielding beneath the shared blanket. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead to his and whispered the words she had once spoken before, heavier now with promise. No more alone. Grant closed his eyes, breathing her in until his chest filled with a deep, fierce peace. The days that followed were still a test. Food was scarce, and the forest unforgiving, yet the bond between them steadied every hour. Grant began teaching her small English words, fire, snow, and she answered with Apache names for the same things, laughing softly when he stumbled over the sounds. For the first time in years, the quiet of his life wasn't an empty weight. It was alive with her voice and gentle laughter. At night, their closeness no longer held caution. Her hand would trace the scar at his temple. His arm would slip around her waist until their breathing fell in rhythm. The fire might fade, but the warmth between them stayed bright. One evening, as the sun slid low and cast gold across the softening snow, Grant stood at the cave mouth with Ahyoka at his side. The world beyond was waking. He heard the river breaking free beneath the ice and saw dark earth showing through thinning drifts. Spring was on the move. Her fingers slid into his lacing firm. He turned to her, and she met his gaze without fear. In that look, he knew that when they left this cave, it would be together not as two storm-bound strangers, but as partners ready for whatever waited beyond the mountains. The thought took root as the river cracked wider and its roar echoed through the valley. Each day, more snow pulled back from the pines, leaving bare ground and scattered branches. Birds returned first, their calls ringing sharp and new. By the second week of thaw, Grant knew the cave was no longer a cage of survival. It had become their shelter, but the outside world now called them forward. One morning, he stood with axe in hand at the cave mouth, watching the forest breathe again. Ahyoka stepped beside him, blanket draped over her shoulders, dark hair lifting in the breeze. Her eyes rested on the green hints below. She said nothing, only reached for his hand. Grant twined their fingers, the gesture quiet and final. Inside their supplies were nearly gone. Hunting would soon be easier, but the cave had given all it could. He turned to her. "We can't stay here forever," he said. Her jaw set, waiting. "We'll build something," he added. "A cabin near the timber. My hands can raise it. We'll have more than scraps, more than hiding." For a long breath she was silent. Then she nodded, slow and sure. Together she said the single word carrying the weight of a vow. They gathered their few belongings. Grant packed his axe flint and canteen. Ahyoka wrapped her blanket close and carried her clay pot and bone needle as if they were treasures. Before leaving, she crouched by the fire pit one last time, laid a hand on the stones she had stacked months ago, then let it fall. The cave had kept her alive, but she no longer belonged to its shadows. The trek down the valley was hard. Snow clung in patches, and the ground was slick. Grant broke the trail, steadying her when the slope turned icy. She followed without complaint, steps sure. By midday, the sun was high, and the smell of thawed earth rose around them. That afternoon, they reached the river. Grant cut branches and bound them into a rough raft, while Ahyoka steadied the knots. Pushing into the current, they fought the pull of the water until they gained the far bank. She climbed out, knees sinking in the mud, and let out a quick, surprised laugh. Grant answered with a rare, unguarded smile. 2 days later, they neared the edge of a small frontier town. Grant slowed at the sight of rooftops and smoke, his jaw tight. He had avoided places like this for years, and for Ahyoka the risk was even greater. "If we go in, people will stare," he warned quietly. "Maybe worse." "Are you sure?" Her chin lifted, eyes steady. "With you," she said simply. They stepped into town together. Just as Grant Steele had expected, whispers rippled through the dusty street, a scarred white lumberjack walking hand in hand with an Apache widow. Some onlookers narrowed their eyes, others looked quickly away, but no one dared to block their path. Grant tightened his grip on Ahyoka Moon's hand, daring anyone to test them. Inside the general store, he bought tools, seed flour, and a warm new coat for her, laying silver, earned from years of logging on the counter. The shopkeeper, Hank Rourke, let his stare linger a beat too long, but Grant ignored it. When Ahyoka slipped the coat over her shoulders, her eyes softened, and she touched his arm, a silent thank you that said more than words. They didn't linger. By sundown, they were heading back toward the high timber country. Grant chose a ridge near the river ground, firm trees thick and tall. There they set to work. He felled the pines and trimmed them clean while Ahyoka gathered stones for a hearth, her movements steady and tireless. At night they slept beneath the open sky, a bright fire roaring beside the sound of rushing water. Day by day, the cabin walls rose. By the time the first buds opened on the cottonwoods, a sturdy home stood on the ridge. One evening, Grant ran a rough hand over the finished logs, sweat dark on his shirt, and looked toward the doorway. Ahyoka stood there, wrapped in her blanket, firelight shining in her dark eyes. Something shifted deep inside him. For years he had cut timber only to sell it to move on. Now, for the first time, the wood he worked had built a life instead of feeding emptiness. That night, sitting together by their own fire, Ahyoka leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Grant laced his fingers through hers. "This is ours now," he said quietly. She lifted her face and kissed him, soft, lingering. When she drew back, her voice was firm and clear. "Family." Grant closed his eyes and let the word settle in his chest. After years of grief and silence, after the storm that had driven him to a cave he never meant to find, he was no longer a man alone in the timber. And she was no longer a widow hiding in stone. They had chosen not merely to survive, but to stay. As spring spread across the valley, Grant and Ahyoka stepped from their cabin, side by side. The land stretched before them, no longer a threat, but a home. When the breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth, Grant knew there would be no more leaving for him, for her, for the life they now shared. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.